You're watching National Streaming Sports. Over 20 podcasts, 70 shows, and a 3.5-star rating on Roku TV. Check out nessp.info for direct links and deals on the site Bet Us for 125% off your first three deposits in NFL and college odds for upcoming games, Major League Baseball and NBA futures, and boxing wagers. Also, check out Fanatics sportswear for your favorite teams, and also network merchandise, retro, Northeast Streaming Sports, National Streaming Sports, Big Football, and the Mac and Jack Sports Show t-shirts. Coffee mugs are coming soon. Check it out. Yes, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sports Memory Show. We got Doc back for this week. We got James, of course, and Jack, as we're going to go over some of the greatest players and members of our sports history. As sports, as we know, sports history brings us today and tells us a lot about why we have what we have today in sports. And right off the rip, I want to make a couple announcements really quick. The Eagles did beat the Green Bay Packers last night. Saquon Barkley has a big day. And the Yankees get a win as they keep pace with the Orioles, as I think that first place is going to be fought all year till the end of the year anyway. So that's kind of a quick sports update for you, but we're here to talk about some legends in each sport, teams that were unbelievable during a certain time. And we're going to start off with Doc and the legend himself, Duke Snider.
Yeah, so Duke Snider, every week we get our assignment from the boss, Mac. He tells us who we're going to talk about. And Duke Snider is one of those guys that's actually really fun to talk about because he is, or was, one of the greatest players, one of the greatest center fielders in the history of baseball. But people don't remember that. And the reason they don't remember how great Duke Snider was because he was overshadowed because there were three teams in New York at the time. And he played the same position as Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle. And so it was, people used to say, and there's that great song from the 1980s, Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. And when you're comparing Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, and Duke Snider, well, Duke comes up third, always. In fact, when you look at Duke Snider's career, some people might say, how can you say he was one of the greatest center fielders ever when he never won a Gold Glove award, when he never won an MVP award, when he never had a 50 home run season, when he never had 200 hits in a season? His lifetime batting average was under 300. He never led the league in stolen bases, but he did lead the league in getting caught stealing. And you say to yourself, that doesn't sound like one of the great players, but he was. He was also overshadowed by the team itself, the Boys of Summer, the legendary Dodgers of the 1950s. And there's so many great players on those Dodger teams, legendary players like Pee Wee Reese, Gil Hodges, Roy Campanella, Sal Maglie, Don Newcomb, and of course, Jackie Robinson, that are so large and are so dynamic that they sometimes make the people around them seem smaller. And yet, Duke Snider, I'm going to read to you from his biography on the Baseball Reference bullpen page because it just says it all. A graceful center fielder with a powerful picture-perfect swing, Duke Snider was the biggest bat in the Brooklyn Dodgers' potent five-time World Series-bound lineup of the 1950s. He hit 40 or more homers 5 consecutive times and led all batters in home runs and runs batted in during the 1950s. He's the only player to hit 4 homers in 2 different fall classics. He did that in 1952 and he did it in 1955. And his 11 World Series home runs and 26 runs batted in are the most ever by a National League player. Now, of course, he was also the center fielder when the Dodgers moved to LA. And he was the first Dodger to get a hit in the LA Coliseum. And then he was the first Dodger to get a hit in Dodger Stadium. But here's what happens. I'm gonna just give a couple of statistics here. If you go and you look and you get into WAR, and I know people get all upset about that, but we're just going to use this on a very basic level. If you type in the all-time leaders in center fielders, he ranks right there with the best of them. He's not at the tippy top. The number 1 center fielder of all time is Willie Mays. Then you have Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, Mickey Mantle. And then you had is the operative word, Joe DiMaggio, and then Duke Snider. That made him, at the time of the end of his career, the 6th greatest center fielder of all time. They didn't have these stats and these charts back then, but looking at it today, that's where he would be. Today, he dropped to 8th because Mike Trout and Ken Griffey Jr. have moved above him, but he's still number 8 all time. You can name any other center fielder who's ever played. They come in underneath Duke Snider. And here's the other interesting thing. When he retired, Duke Snider was only the 10th player ever to amass 400 or more home runs. 10th. He ended with 407. When he did that, that was amazing. Only 9 other guys had ever done that in the history of baseball. Here's what happens. Over time, the home run, as we all know, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, became something that was much more common. Today, because of the proliferation of home runs, Duke Snider ranks 58th. So you say to yourself, well, he's the 58th, 407 home runs. It's not all that impressive. Because sometimes when we look at statistics and we look at players, we look at it from the current numbers, how they look today. But in his day, what he did was tremendous. He was also obviously on 2 world championship teams, the famous Boys of Summer, the 1955 Dodgers. And then after they moved to LA, the Dodgers won the World Series again in 1959. So one of the greats of the game, overshadowed by Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, but really in that upper echelon all time among great ball players, the legendary Duke Snider.
Doc, you're leaving a tiny thing out. He was also a New York Met at the end of his career.
And a Giant. He did spend a little time on the
Oh,
Giants.
I didn't realize it was the Giants, but think of how ironic that was when he played for the Mets. I don't remember whether it was in 62 when the Mets were an expansion team or the next year, 63 when he joined, and whether he was an original Met or not.
He was a Met in 1963, played 129 games, batted .243, hit 14 home runs. The next year, 64, he actually played for the Giants. He played in 91 games and batted only .210. And those last couple of years, like Mantle, is what brought his batting average underneath 300 for his career.
But think of how ironic that was. When he was a Dodger, they hated the Giants' guts, everything about him. And the Polo Grounds was enemy territory. And now when he's a Met, the Mets played in the Polo Grounds. So imagine him going to enemy territory each day. It's like Derek Jeter having to play at Fenway Park at the end of his career, like all his games. You know, it's kind of an unusual situation.
And yeah,
I just want to ask you this: at peak value, not over his career, at his absolute peak, was Duke Snider as good as Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays at his peak?
All right, I'll give you a number. It's called WAR 7, where they take your 7 greatest seasons and they add up your WAR, basically. I'll give you the numbers. Willie Mays, 73.5 at his peak. Mickey Mantle, 64.7. Duke Snider, still a great number, 49.5, but he's definitely not in Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle's class. He is close to DiMaggio. DiMaggio's peak value is 52.1. Snider's 49.5. That's not far off.
7 seasons isn't peak value. If they did it for 3 seasons, okay. But 7 seasons is too long. That's more like a career than peak value.
All right, so let me look at Duke Snider career real fast. If there's a statistic called OPS plus, which basically normalizes your statistics against the league average. So if you have a 100, that's an average ball player. And if you're having a great season, it goes higher than that, obviously. His 3 best years were 1954, his OPS plus was 171. Then in 55, it was 169. And in 53, it was 165. So his 3 best years in order, 53, 54, 55, were right in order chronologically. And those were also his 3 best years with OPS plus. The highest he ever got was 171. I believe, I'm just going to click on Willie Mays real fast here. I believe Willie Mays had a couple of 200, or nope, he didn't. He had a 185, a 175, a 175, a 174, a 173, a 172. That just tells you that he was much better than Duke on a year-to-year basis. And if we look at Mantle real quickly, I think Mantle had a 200 OPS plus season, but again, I could be wrong there. I thought he did. Yeah, he did. Mickey Mantle had 3. 221, 210, and 206. He plus also had a 196, a 195, a 188. So no, he was great, but he wasn't in their class. Short term, long term, no matter how you break it up.
To be the 8th of all time. I mean, this is why we do this show, folks, because nobody says that about Duke Snider. Nobody, probably, I would say 3/4 of the people, maybe 2/3 of the people, don't even know who the hell Duke Snider is. I mean, this is why we do this show, folks, because, you know, and a lot of rules have changed. The ball has changed over the years so many times. You know, everything has changed as far as the ball, the lightness of the bat, the tightness of the ball. All this stuff has changed. Training has changed. I mean, we could go in, we could do a whole show on that. It's just to realize that this guy that, you know, people really don't know about it. We talked about with Stan the Man, that they don't talk about Stan the Man anymore. Same thing with Duke Snider. I mean, you're talking, this is the 7th best center fielder of all time. People should be talking about him. We talk about the 7th greatest basketball player, the 7th greatest, you know, quarterback. But I mean, this is the kind of stuff I love, Doc. I mean, great job with that. If Duke Snider, and what I would call Duke Snider is maybe the backbone of the Dodgers, right? I mean, he was a guy that was steady, hitting home runs, driving in runs, making big hits. You know, you need that type of player on your team to be successful if you're going to be a champion, or if you're going to at least contend for championships, right? So, I mean, I would think he was one of maybe 2 of the backbones of the Dodgers. I think they call him something, the Duke of Flatbush, was a nickname.
Yeah, the Duke of Flatbush. Yep.
If I'm not correct. So listen, this is why we do the show. I love this.
Doc makes a good point. Him being surrounded by other players. Now, if you compare him to, let's say, a Ted Williams or Stan Musial, even though we could probably name a couple of teammates of Musial or Ted Williams, they don't come to mind when we mention Stan Musial. We don't think of his teammates. We don't think of Ted Williams' teammates, but we think of Duke Snider's teammates immediately. You know, a few of them come to mind: Pee Wee Reese, Jackie Robinson, Gil Hodges, Roy Campanella. So in a way, he gets swept along that wave with them, and it might diminish his greatness as far as perception goes.
Great point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think everybody pales in comparison when you're comparing them to the legend of Jackie Robinson. I'll tell you a little quick story. Yeah. When I was a principal, I would read to the kids in 2nd grade, and I would do this once a week in every classroom. And during baseball season, I would read baseball books. And if you go back 14 or 15 years, when I started as an elementary school principal, and I would read a book about Babe Ruth, I would say to the kids, before I would start all this, who is the most legendary baseball player of all time, the greatest baseball player? And up until maybe 6 or 7 years ago, kids always said Babe Ruth. Whether they knew anything about baseball or not, everybody knew the name Babe Ruth. The last few years of my career, whenever I'd ask that question, they'd all say Jackie Robinson. because Jackie Robinson's legend and his impact on the game has grown, and he's so much a face of what baseball is. Jackie Robinson Day, everybody wears number 42, that he has become so large, so great that, again, if you're a teammate of Jackie Robinson's, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider. In fact, there was another piece. I don't have it here in front of me, but Duke Snider was one of the guys who stood up for Jackie Robinson. I could dig that up if we wanted to. But it's hard to match up when you're playing with a legend. Babe Ruth did that. He overshadowed his contemporaries. But today, the biggest name among many people in baseball is Jackie Robinson. So if you're Duke Snider, it's like, yeah, you were also on the team, but that was Jackie's team.
Yeah, and I think you bringing up Jackie Robinson Day. I mean, that is done every year, and that keeps his name alive. So as far as being popular, so Doc, tremendous job. Let's bring up my friend here, James Martin. He's got quite a piece here to talk about today. What do you got for us, James?
Well, first and foremost, Doc, that was great, man. That was a great monologue, man. I learned a lot about Duke Snider today, more than I've ever heard it. I've never even heard a guy like Jack said. Max said that some guys probably never even heard of him, and I'm one of them. And so, that's great. Now, man, we move on to football. Dominance of college football in the 1970s by two teams. We're talking about both Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Sooners, and the Alabama Tide. Man, doing the research on Oklahoma, I'm a huge college football fan, and to see how dominant a team was, particularly when they changed to what's called a wishbone offense. Man, I'd never heard. I mean, I've heard of wishbone. I played it in high school, but to see a team like this dominate at that level was just tremendously impressive. Started in 1970 under Chuck Fairbanks and as the head coach of Oklahoma, and Barry Switzer as their offense coordinator. They were just scratching the surface. They were decent, and they ended up playing at Alabama in the Astro Bluebonnet Bowl, and they tied it. They tied 24-24. But man, 71 would be the year they just turned around. This team played 3 consecutive top-ranked teams. We're talking about number 17 USC, number 3 Texas, and then number 6 Colorado. They dominated all 3 teams. And then they went to what was considered back then the game of the century on November 25th. They ended up playing Nebraska with the champions, the reigning champions, and they lost a close one to them, 35-31. And they end up winning the rest out, and they finished second in the polls. And what I learned back then is that when they voted prior to the bowl games for national champions. And so they had an opportunity to be national champions, but they finished second. But that year, under Jack Mildren, the quarterback, and Greg Pruitt, they rushed for a record that still stands today, a record 472.36 yards per game. Wow. Rushing, not passing. This is just rushing yards. That's just phenomenal. That's incredible. That's like video game numbers. So it's just astounding to me that a team can do this and still only come in second. But eventually, in 73 is when Chuck Fairbanks left, went to the pros to coach the Patriots, and this is where the Barry Switzer era started. And from 72 to 80, they won the Big 8 every year. They won it every year, and they were just very dominant. And of course, and under that time, it was a scandal. There was a scandal under Chuck Fairbanks where the high school recruit, they altered his transcripts that allowed him, a player to play, but it gave them 8 games. They took the games in 71 away. It took 8 games away, and they got a 2-year TV ban, and they also got 2 years of no bowl games. But eventually, during that time, Barry Switzer continued to stay the course. these guys won 2 national championships in 1974 and in 75. And they were just very dominant. Again, during that time, I'm not only talking about Oklahoma, but I'm also talking about Alabama, their reign during the 70s as well. In 1973 is the first one of 3 national championships under Coach Paul Bear Bryant. This guy was already dominant before he even got to the 70s. He won 3 in the 60s. So Matt gave me the discussion to talk about him in the 70s, but he was pretty dominant in the 60s as well. I mean, we're talking about somebody like Joe Namath as a quarterback for him. In the 70s, he had the Snake Stabler, Kenny the Snake Stabler, and he had a lot of other guys. And Bear Bryant was considered a guy that didn't really integrate. He was considered controversial because of supposed racial segregation. But from what he says, he tried to integrate football all the way back to when he was coaching Kentucky, when he coached Texas A&M, and also once he got to 1970, they finally integrated with Wilbur Jackson, a freshman, and they got a guy named John Mitchell as a junior JUCO transfer, and Sylvester Croom was their center eventually, and of course a guy by the name we know him as Ozzie Newsome, who eventually played for him as tight end. But man, they just dominated as well. 1973, 1978, and 1979 were their national championships. But with Alabama, he had a total of 13 SEC championships. So they were always in contention in the 70s. So it's very interesting to see how both these two teams were dominant, and they only met up once in 1970, from what I understand. Looking at these two teams were very dominant. But man, I was just tremendously impressed with both teams. And they went up against dominant teams like Nebraska and beat them. Went up against dominant teams like Notre Dame, Michigan. It was just a tremendously impressive to see 2 separate teams, both eventually. I will add that Bear Bryant was also on a pro style offense, but he eventually as well went to the wishbone offense as well. And so that would seem to shift to bring back that prominence in the 70s that they had in the 60s as well. So, man, I'm just, again, very dominant. Both teams, it's hard to pick one or the other, versus each other. But I would have to say both teams were just tremendously dominant. And again, let me add this one thing. They in 78, Oklahoma was very dominant. They had a running back by the name of Billy Sims. He eventually became the Heisman Trophy winner, running for 1,800 yards, and got drafted and went to Detroit. But they just had Alabama in their way.
Now, the wishbone is sort of the opposite of the triple option. The fullback lines up close. The other 2 running backs, they line up behind him or off to the side of him somewhat. They got the broken bone. They got a lot of different formations off this wishbone. But I know, Jack, I imagine follow college football like I did. I'm not sure about Doc back then. The wishbone, you would have 3 running backs from that formation end up in the pros. I mean, this formation was unbelievable. And as you mentioned, Nebraska and Oklahoma, Oklahoma's kind of been down for a while. Nebraska has been down for a long time. Out in the Midwest, Jack, I mean, these 2 teams were unbelievable back then.
Well, Bud Wilkinson was coaching the Alabama team, later Barry Switzer, and he mastered, running the wishbone. The wishbone to me was boring, though. I mean, it was like baseball, seeing every batter hit a ground ball to second base. It gets to be monotonous after a while, but it worked in college, and I could never understand why it never really worked in the NFL. But now they're kind of bringing back the wishbone in certain ways, because you have quarterbacks in this day and age who could really run well, that keeps the defense honest. Bear Bryant, him recruiting all the black players, there's a question whether he did it because he wanted to correct the social injustice or he wanted to get the edge on the competition. probably a combination of the two, and there's nothing the matter with that. You know, you want to win. You do whatever you can do to win as long as it's not unethical, okay? So Bear Bryant, you know, had the vision, and it took a certain amount of guts for Bear Bryant to do that in Alabama. Keep that in mind, Alabama. But Bear Bryant was so powerful, he'd have a standoff against the racist governor, George Wallace. George Wallace is very powerful, but he knew you couldn't mess with Bear Bryant in Alabama. So they each gave one another kind of their space, because if George Wallace went after Bear Bryant, it wouldn't be too good for him, you know, either. So he had to back off.
Wow, that's a great point. I forgot about that. That's right, Jack. They're in the same time frame. And I mean, listen, the Ku Klux Klan still has roots in Alabama, still is alive in Alabama. So back then, you got to know how strong they were back during, you know, the 70s and before that. You know, and a lot of people, they talk about Nick Saban. Nick Saban is a great coach. I mean, one of the greatest coaches in history at Alabama. But Bear Bryant has won a lot more games than Nick Saban at Alabama. I don't know if he has the record on SEC championships or not compared to Nick Saban. But we always look at the newest guy, like Doc said, in baseball, right? We always look at who the newest guy is there. And we don't look back and say, wow, Alabama was that dominant during a time in football when you had dominant teams. I mean, I don't know if there's a rival to Alabama with Nick Saban as there was with Bear Bryant. And I mean, you could go Woody Hayes. You could go. I mean, there's so many good coaches of the 70s and rivalries that I don't know if it's the same today, Jack. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
No, I think it is the same today. But I don't want to let this go. Bear Bryant had a quarterback. His quarterback was Joe Namath. And it was a different time. Joe Namath revered Bear Bryant. He looked up to him. Joe Namath misses curfew. And Bear Bryant says, sorry, son, we have our rules. You got to miss the bowl game. You got to sit it out. You missed curfew. That wouldn't happen today with a soft quarterback. What would they do? At worst, they'd make him miss the first series of downs. At worst, you know, give him a little slap on the wrist and then move on. And I don't even think they would do that. But that was a different time. And Joe Namath kept a relationship with Bear Bryant when he was with the Jets. Okay, Bear Bryant was the guy he really looked up to him. But Bear Bryant, you know, was an authority figure, and the players respected that. We need more of that today, and, you know, we just don't quite have it. It was a different time.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack,
to answer your question. Sorry.
You go.
To answer your question about the SEC championships, he had a total of 14. One was with Kentucky in 1950. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
That's amazing. Hey, Jack, when I started becoming a Jets fan, my favorite quarterback was a graduate of Alabama. What was his name?
John Hewitt?
A Jet quarterback who went to Alabama.
Joe Namath was the Jet quarterback that went to Alabama. You mean someone else?
That's correct.
Okay. Wow.
Is it John Hewitt or that's
Richard Todd?
Oh, that's so obvious. So obvious.
That's so amazing, right?
Obvious. I thought you were trying to trick me. That was so obvious. That's
Richard
like
Todd.
the hell was right in front of me and I still missed it. Oh, man. Richard Todd.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, and Richard Todd became a Jet at the same time as Joe Namath. Well, you know, like when he was drafted. Joe Namath was the Jets start, and they transitioned to Richard Todd. And Richard Todd, as you know, started well as the Jet quarterback, and then it didn't quite, you know, work out.
Now listen, Richard Todd, wasn't Richard Todd one of the big classes there? Was that the class of '83, Jack? Richard Todd?
No, that's Kenny O'Brien. That
Kenny
big
O'Brien,
quarterback
my bad.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's very interesting. Yes. So we got Jack up next. He's going to talk a little boxing with us. Jack has Ken Norton in 1970s. Now, Ken Norton was part, whether you liked him or you didn't. I mean, he's a big, strong looking guy. And he and him, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, and Muhammad Ali, and we'll get to them in the upcoming weeks here. Ken Norton was part of that. And, he is in the Hall of Fame, Jack. What do you got on
they were the core four, like you talk about the Yankee core four. They were the core four: Ali, Foreman, Frazier, and Norton. And Ken Norton, if you looked at his physique, you would swear he was on steroids. But no, he wasn't on it. He just had the natural physique. He was a Marine. He came up, and served kind of an apprenticeship. He was in the Joe Frazier camp. Joe Frazier's sparring partner for a number of years, because Ken Norton's trainer was the great Eddie Futch, who was Joe Frazier's assistant trainer. So Ken Norton became very close with Joe Frazier on both a professional and a personal basis. They were great friends. And you talk about the biggest upset of all time in boxing history. People are going to point to Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson. But on March 31st, 1973, Ken Norton pulled off a shocking upset when he beat Muhammad Ali on a split decision in his hometown of San Diego. He legitimately deserved the decision. Ali suffered a broken jaw in the process, and Ali suffered a broken jaw early in the fight, even though there's some debate, because Howard Cosell was commenting about something being unusual with Ali's jaw, early in the fight. So he wins a split decision there. And some people thought it was an aberration because Ali wasn't really in good shape for that fight. Ali had fought Frazier 2 years before in the fight of the century, and then he fought a number of guys and really didn't train that hard, but they had a rematch. And Norton, came close. Ali won a split decision in Los Angeles like 6 months after, he'd beaten Ali the first time. And then Norton, as a result of that strong effort against Ali in the second fight, he got a shot at George Foreman for the heavyweight championship, even though he was coming off technically a loss. Bad style up to Ken Norton, terrible style matchup. Foreman obliterates him in 2 rounds, but Norton bounces back, looks great, stopping Jerry Quarry at Madison Square Garden. It's looking good. Then he fights Ali in a rubber match in September 1976. I was there at Yankee Stadium. Most people feel Norton won the fight. I thought he barely edged it out. It was close. It could have gone either way. It really could have gone either way, even though I thought Norton nipped it. Ali gets the decision, but the perception was that Norton won. He was robbed. He wasn't robbed, even though I thought, perhaps he edged it out. And Ali doesn't want a 4th fight. And Norton, of course, doesn't want to fight George Foreman, because that would have been a nightmare, matchup for him to go in for a rematch, because Norton moved forward, and anyone moving right into George Foreman is going to have some serious problems. So what happens when Ali gets upset by Leon Spinks, and Ali's at the end of the line, basically. And Leon Spinks had an option: give Ali a rematch or fight Norton. But if he wasn't going to fight Norton, he was told that World Boxing Council, WBC, would strip him of the title. So what happened in the meantime? Norton fights this clever Philadelphia fighter, Jimmy Young. And I think Young clearly won the fight, but Norton gets the decision. And because Spinks wouldn't fight Norton, then the WBC declares him as their heavyweight champion. And because the perception is that Norton should have gotten the decision over Ali in the 3rd fight, people regard Norton as a world heavyweight champion. And it's debatable whether he was a belt holder or a legitimate world heavyweight champion, because he never really won it in the ring, if you want to look at it that way. But then Norton engages, a couple of years later, in June of 1978, with Larry Holmes in an epic fight. 15 rounds, Holmes wins a split decision. 2 cards have Holmes up by 1 point, another has Norton up by 1 point. Go to the tape of the 15th round of that fight. 15th round is the greatest round, arguably, in boxing history, or one of the greatest rounds. Those guys empty their tank and they go at it. It was remarkable what they could do at the end of the fight, at the 15th round. But basically, that was Norton's last hurrah. He started to go downhill after that, and his career ended in 1981 in Madison Square Garden when he was viciously knocked out in one round by Jerry Cooney. You know, there was a certain arrogance to Norton that I didn't like. You know, he wasn't one of my favorite fighters because of the arrogance. Now, he may have been a nice guy, but I'll give you an example, like the little remarks he would make. He knocked out a fighter, Dwayne Bobbitt, an unbeaten prospect, Greg White Hope type, in one round. At that time, Bobbitt was trained by Eddie Futch, Norton's old trainer, and Norton moved on from his old trainer because his managers didn't like the trainer who trained them like his whole pro career. Later, Norton said that was the biggest mistake he ever made. If he could take it back, he would have done it in a flash. But whatever. So Norton says about Dwayne Bobbitt, after knocking him out in the first round in 58 seconds, he says, he's a darn good fighter. He could have gotten knocked out at any time. It just so happened it was in 58 seconds of the first round. Arrogant remark. And then Norton was kind of manipulative. He said something to the effect, later on in his career, when he wanted to fight for the title again, he says, well, how do you figure out boxing? I beat Ali 3 times. Ali owned George Foreman, and Foreman beat me. Meanwhile, he didn't beat Ali 3 times. He beat him once of the 3 fights. And Foreman obliterated Norton, but Norton saying, oh, Ali owned Foreman, but Foreman beat me. It was, you know, those manipulative remarks, and he had a certain arrogance about him. Now, years later, Norton retired. Norton's body had taken a heavy toll, I think more outside the ring than in it. He crashed his motorcycle going reportedly way over the speed limit or whatever. And it was life and death when he was in the hospital. And Norton even joked what helped him get better. He had to get out of the hospital because Ali visited him and was showing him magic tricks and driving him crazy, which is a nice story, by the way. But Norton had this arrogance about him. I just want to say, years later, I'm at a medical convention, this medical group I'm involved with. Norton's a guest speaker. He's in a wheelchair, but he could get up and he could walk if he had to. But he would have more comfort in a wheelchair. So it's the ringside physician who I was close with, Norton and his wife and myself all of a sudden locked in conversation. I mean, I'm like, how did I wind up there? And all of a sudden, the ringside physician, Don Norton's wife, wants to do something. She says, why did you take Ken around? So meanwhile, I'm wheeling him around, and I'm not sure, and I'm only joking, whether I want to crash him into the wall or not. I'm joking, of course, completely joking. But we got to talk, and any of the negative feelings I had, I kind of let go because, you know, we were there with just the two of us hanging out, you know, and I'm going around with them, which I thought was kind of, you know, around it. But Ken Norton, a heck of a fighter, but he, you know, and him and Joe Frazier, they talked about fighting, the two of them. And this is partly about Norton's attitude. Frazier said, I'm never going to fight Ken Norton. He's my buddy. He's my friend. They're going to have to offer us such a ridiculous sum of money that we can't turn it down. But I have no interest in fighting him. He's my buddy, so forget about it. I want to hear about the fight being made. Norton says, well, Joe is my buddy, but business is business, you know? So it was kind of different attitudes. So.
Wow. That's an awesome story, Jack.
I like Ken Norton today. I mean, he's no longer alive, but I have good feelings towards him, you know?
Yeah. It's funny because like you said, Norton walked forward, Frazier walked forward, and with I mean, when you hit George Foreman, he looked mad. He would make a face like, I don't believe you just hit me. And it was Foreman was funny. I mean that guy. I remember Frazier catching him a left hook, and it stunned him. But he just looked at Frazier like, how dare you hit me with that hook? And destroyed Frazier, destroyed Norton. When Cooney beat him, Jack, because I was watching him, of course, when Cooney was coming up, another great white hope. He was labeled this by the media because he's so big. And when he saw what happened to Norton, it was like, oh my God, this dude just knocked Norton out of the ring. And I really believe Cooney was going to be the next heavyweight champion, Jack. Was Norton up in age at that time?
Yeah, Norton was past his peak. Cooney knocked him out in 54 seconds. Norton was let's say, a little better than average fighter, perhaps, at that time, but that's about it. He was not nearly the fighter he was. I mean, what would have happened had he fought Cooney in his prime? That would have been another, maybe really bad style matchup for Norton, because Norton came forward. That's why Norton could do so well against Ali and Larry Holmes, because those guys were in powerhouses, The Norton's aggression worked very well with them in his boxing skill. He had a really good jab moving forward. And Ali and Holmes couldn't overpower Norton. A Foreman could overpower him. A Cooney may have been able to overpower Pete Norton. And Ernie Shavers knocked Norton out in a round when Norton, towards the end of his career. Well, could Norton have done a lot better against Shavers and Cooney, early in his career? Perhaps. I mean, maybe his style wouldn't have allowed him to do it. I don't know. But George Foreman always would have been a terrible style matchup for him, because he's not going to outbox Foreman, because Norton was at his best moving forward. He couldn't really circle around and, buy a lot of time.
Yeah. Do you think the trainers knew this before the fights, Jack? Like when Norton went to fight Foreman or when Frazier went to fight Foreman, do you think the trainers in advance knew, this is not a good idea to fight these guys?
Well, the finances dictate it. If you're getting an opportunity and it's a big fight, I mean, you can't say, no, I'm not going to take it. The styles are wrong for me, unless you have other options. Then you take other, fights. But, when Norton fought, he had to go for the heavyweight title. I mean, whoever held the heavyweight title, that was the goal.
Yeah.
And now in this day and age, you could maybe skirt around certain opponents. You don't like their style. But Norton just had no alternative but, to fight those guys. Even Ali, when he didn't want to fight Norton the fourth time, and George Foreman was starting to ask for a rematch against Ali, Ali said basically, yeah, I'll fight the winner of a fight between Foreman and Norton, a rematch. Let Foreman and Norton have a rematch, and I'll fight the winner. Because Ali figured Foreman's going to knock Norton out again. And Ali thought, I'll have an easier time with Foreman than I will with Norton. So he gets Norton out of the way.
Right. So, but, there was only one champion. Was it one champion at that time, right, Jack? Weren't they all undisputed at that time? I know there was.
Norton held a WBC title, but the heavyweight title was bigger than anything else. We all knew who the champion, was. I mean, if I looked through boxing history, if we had the different sanctioning bodies, Max Schmeling never would have had a rematch with Joe Louis, even though right. Max Schmeling being the first time, because one of the sanctioning bodies would have declared Schmeling as the champion, so he never would have had the rematch with Louis. He would have had a claim to the title. I mean, boxing, I can't say enough negative things about boxing, the way it's administered. It's like in baseball. The New York Yankees have a magic name. They haven't been World Series champions since 2009. If this were boxing administering it, there'd be 4 major league champions, and the Yankees would have been one of them at least a couple of times since 2009, because their box office So imagine when there's a new baseball federation, they declare the Yankees, Major League Baseball's champions, so they set up their own World Series tournament. They have the Yankees meet, the Tampa Bay Rays in a title eliminator to see, who meets the Minnesota Twins to be the champions.
Right.
It sounds absurd, but that's the sport of boxing.
Yeah. I mean, they would like have their own little tournaments to have the new yeah, I get it, man. I get it. Yeah, it's crazy. So, yeah, great job again, Jack. I love that wheelchair story. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was only joking about crashing the wheelchair. Yeah, I didn't really make it. I'm only joking. I would never, I was trying to be funny, and it wasn't that funny what I said. So but when I got to talk to him that afternoon and go around with him, I got to like the guy, soft-spoken, nice and everything. And made me understand why I heard, some people say nice things about him otherwise, Good man. And his son, Ken Norton Jr., was a great NFL player and NFL coordinator for years, to keep that in mind, too. So powerful genes he had that he passed on to his son.
Was Ken Norton Jr. interested, Jack? Do you know if he was interested in going into boxing?
Well, whenever he made a big play in football, he'd run to the goalpost and kind of punch it.
Yes.
Throw some punches. So that was to kind of honor his father, in a sense.
Very cool. Very cool.
And Ken Norton was a single dad for a while, who with Ken Norton Jr. So he showed accountability, in that sense, when his son was young.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad there were no stairs nearby. We would have had to call the ambulance and all that at that event. So I'm glad there was no stairs close to Jack.
No. Man, it was a bad joke. I tried to be funny with it.
It was funny.
Good man, Ken
It was funny.
Yeah.
It was funny, Jack. Don't hold back. That was great. I mean, anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1970 Dolphins and how dominant they were, especially early in the 70s. They went to the playoffs 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 78, and 79. In 1972, they finished the 14 regular seasons as undefeated, and they went on to play the Washington Redskins. At that time, their defense was known as the Over the Hill Gang, and they won a real close game, 14-7, a pretty defensive a struggle there. But following that, in 1973, they dominated the Vikings. Don Shula got hired away from the Colts after the loss to the New York Jets. They called that's really the first Super Bowl. I mean, since then they've kind of called, the Packers and the Raiders and the Packers and Chiefs Super Bowls. At that time, they were the NFL, AFL championship, but they kind of renamed them the Super Bowl. It was really named the Super Bowl in 1969 when the Jets and the Colts actually played the game. So they do call that now Super Bowls, with Green Bay winning. But at the time, it wasn't a Super Bowl. It came up with a Super Bowl named after when the Jets played.
Matt, can I just say one thing quick? Don Shula, maybe I heard wrong, wasn't fired as Colts coach.
No.
I heard it wrong, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, he left. He just left. Miami.
Not that year. He coached the Colts one more year, and they had an 8-5-1 record. And he left when he was under contract to go to the Dolphins, and Commissioner Pete Rozelle resolved it by giving the Colts the Dolphins' #1 draft choice.
Draft pick, yeah, right? Okay. Correct. And again, in that perfect season, Don Greasy got hurt, the starting quarterback in the 5th game. Earl Morrall took over for Don Greasy, Bob Greasy. Earl Morrall was on the Super Bowl team with the Colts, and he actually filled in for Johnny Unitas during the year and into the Super Bowl. At that year, when he took over Dolphins, Earl Morrall had his best year of his career that year. I guess Bob Greasy did injure his knee. So anyway, he replaced him. He was really the quarterback during that perfect season. but really it was a running heavy offense. You had Larry Zonka and you had Mercury Morris, who both had 1,000 yards. They were the first backfield ever to both have 1,000-yard seasons that year. And of course, Paul Warfield at that time was their leading receiver. A great running offensive line. You had Larry Little and Jim Langer, who both were Hall of Famers. You had the no-name defense led by Nick Bonacani, with defensive end Bill Stanfield, and defensive tackle Manny Fernandez, and they had two great safeties, Dick Anderson and Jack Scott. When they got to the playoffs, maybe because of what happened in the Super Bowl against the Jets, Don Shula pulls are immoral, and he puts in Bob Griese. And Bob Griese, of course, he's coming off the injury, but he played really well. And they end up going to the Super Bowl, as I said, against the Redskins. The Redskins
they pulled them in the playoff game. Yeah.
Yes. And as they went and they played the Redskins, again, a run-heavy offense against a great Redskins defense. They got 14 points. The Redskins ended up getting a special team touchdown on that famous play where Gary Upremian ends up with the ball and is going to try and throw it, and it just went crazy. And the Redskins scored a touchdown on that play. The following year, again, Zonka runs for over 1,000 yards. Mercury Morris has 954 yards. He only misses 1,000 yards, by 6 yards. So they almost did it again. Jim Kick, again, another good running back, a good piece to that running game. He was a runner, caught the ball out of the backfield. But Nick Bonacani again shines. He ends up returning a fumble for a touchdown. That time, Dick Anderson leads in interceptions. With like 11. Jack Scott comes up with 8. The safeties of the Dolphins were unbelievable back then. But the defense was named, believe it or not, no name by Tom Landry. Tom Landry said, you don't know any of the names there. So when he played the Dolphins, he called them the no name defense. But again, at that time, the league was a running league, right? The passing was spared. Bob Griese ends up in the Hall of Fame. He was an MVP. He was, I think he was one-time MVP, excuse me. But he didn't throw for a lot of yards. High percentage passer, threw the ball off play action to Warfield and to Kick, and they kept it go. Larry Zonka ended up having 3 years in a row 1,000-yard rusher. And if anybody has ever watched, if you haven't watched Larry Zonka run, YouTube him. I mean, this guy was an animal. Mercury Morris was kind of like that high maintenance kind of guy, like Dwayne Thomas was for the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, he was like a kind of a diva, but a great running back, and he had his off-field problems also. But they called Jim Kick and Larry Zonka the Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. I mean, they were well known everywhere. But again, Miami went on to win a couple other Super Bowls. I'll bring up John Riggins just to make Doc happy there. That another Larry Zonka type, maybe a little faster than Larry Zonka, but a Larry Zonka type of guy. And Don Shula, of course, is still the leader in wins of all time. Bill Belichick's trying to chase this guy. Jack, what I really appreciate about coaching back then, they came up with certain things. These great coaches, the Landrys, the Chuck Knowles, they came up with unbelievable designs to defense and running games, making plays look the same. I mean, back then you had to have a running game to win. There was no doubt about it. You're not going to win. Back then, a Super Bowl, Steelers had Franco Harris, and Dolphins had this guy Marv Hubbard, or with the Raiders. I mean, you needed a big, strong running back then. But if you love football and you love to watch coaching, the designs of these guys were unbelievable back then. So I really enjoyed the football of the 70s, even though the AFC dominated, I'm an NFC guy. But I really enjoyed the matchups A lot of times it was just, smash mouth, hard defense, and then that big throw out of nowhere ended up winning the game at the end or something. I really enjoyed that a lot. So
Yeah, the Dolphins won one more Super Bowl after their unbeaten season, and they had a better team the following year. The team that went 12-2 in the regular season than the team that was unbeaten. The team that was unbeaten to me wasn't a powerhouse.
right.
They were like an excellent team. They won a number of close games. And if you look at what the unbeaten team did in the playoffs, they beat the Cleveland Browns in their first game in the playoffs 20-14. They were losing the game with a little over 8 minutes left. They were down 14-13. A great powerhouse team, an all-time best team, is not going to be behind with such a little amount of time left against just a plain ordinary playoff team. They'll roll over them. I don't care. But then they did beat, a great Steelers to B team. The Steelers had all those great players that would win 4 out of 6 Super Bowls. They were 2 years away. They were in the early stages, but kudos to the Dolphins for beating them. And they did dominate that game with the Washington Redskins. They were 14-0. The Redskin offense couldn't do a thing with the Dolphins. But the following year, they were really a powerhouse team that beat the Vikings 24-7 in the Super Bowl. And they tried to three-peat, but they lost the game before the Super Bowl to the Oakland Raiders.
Yes.
They had injuries, the Dolphins, and Kenny Stabler won it at the end as he was falling down. He somehow got rid of the ball, and it found its way into the end zone for a catch. Miraculously, the Dolphins were deprived.
And that's a great point because they mentioned that 12-2 team had a harder record. Of course, they're a first place team. They had to beat a lot of great teams during the regular season. In fact, they won their first 5. So their streak was really 18 games that they had consecutive wins. But Jack brings up a great point because the year before that, the schedule was kind of soft because they weren't a winning team. That following year, they had to play a lot of good first place teams, division winners, and that 12-2 record is a better sign of how good they were compared to that perfect season, Jack. So that
12-2 team was better than the unbeaten team the year before, maybe because they were all together and there was that confidence factor. Whatever it was, that 12-2 team, that was a powerful team. Not that the unbeaten team was a great team, but saying just because they were unbeaten, I don't put them up on my short list of the greatest NFL teams of all time.
I kind of agree with you. I think they're up there, but I don't know if they're not. It's top 10 easy, but I don't know if it's a top 3.
I wouldn't even say easy, but it's hard to keep them out of the top 10.
It is
because they were unbeaten.
It is very.
Well, I have a question. How do you compare that unbeaten team versus the Patriots in 07?
Patriots had a better team.
I think they had a better team too. I think they had a lot better team than the Patriots. But again, they didn't.
You said that? No, the Patriots had a better team.
But they lost. But they did lose the Super Bowl. And that's. What do you say? I don't know. If you're the best, you got to win.
Giant fan is coming out of
They
him.
had to play. Keep this in mind. The Patriots had to play 2 more regular season games. So the Patriots actually were 18-0 when they took on the Giants, and the Dolphins finished their season after the Super Bowl at 17-0. It's hard to compare. Yeah, the number of teams like the 49ers who were lost 1 regular season game. Teams like that. The Bears lost 1 regular season game. We're going to say the Dolphins are better because the Bears lost 1 game. We weren't beaten. They weren't. Then I'm going to make the argument Rocky Marciano was definitely better than Muhammad Ali because he was unbeaten his career. Floyd Mayweather was better than Sugar Ray Robinson because he was unbeaten. Because they didn't lose a fight. You can't use that logic.
I agree. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Up after this is Keith Angle on our Roku channel. And remember, tomorrow, the big football show, regular season starts. Be there. It's going to be a great show, as it always is. But we get to talk about real games and real matchups. And we give you our picks. and we take your picks too. We'll see you. Have a great Saturday, folks. Thanks to all you guys. Great job. And thanks to all of you.